Hello, everybody. I can see that we have participants coming. We are very happy to welcome you. You can see down here, you have, if you hover my face with your mouse, you see a chat and you see a Q&A. If you could say a quick hello in the chat. So I know that you can hear me well, you can see me well, and that you are happy today. And then we feel good when we don't feel all alone and we know that they are humans. Oh yeah! And in the chat, you can choose to write to the speakers, Quinn and me, and to the speakers and the participants. And if you choose to talk to the speakers and the participants, it's even better. Hey! So we are really happy that you are here. And I can see people from Berlin, from Lucerne, from Zurich. Oh yeah. From Lausanne. My God, Vietnam, that's fun. Woo, I'm so happy we are so many. So, as you might know, if I have contacted you over LinkedIn, I have contacted many new people for this meetup because I was really sad that all conferences were cancelled in 2020 because of the COVID. So I felt like networking was really sad in 2020. So I'm happy to see many new people here. So first of all, let me introduce you the meetup so you know a little bit more about what we're doing here. I'm going to share my screen, which is here. There you go. So about Content Strategy Lausanne, it's a local meetup, a local chapter of a Content Strategy meetup that I've started about 2.5 years ago. It was about the time when I started to work full-time on products. I was working in a web agency and I was doing like more marketing stuff. And then I started really writing for products. And I really needed to meet other people who were doing the same thing and share ideas. As you know, content strategy and UX writing it's an emerging field in Switzerland, especially in the French-speaking part where I am now. And so there are not many people who have that job titles, and very often the companies, they don't even know the difference between marketing and content strategy and UX writing. So this meetup was also a good way for me to sort of share the knowledge and educate a bit the clients. So it's now 2 years later and we are now online. So we are not going to share drink, but we're going to share good time. And let me tell you how we are going to do it. So I'm going to intro you a few saved dates because we have other speakers coming up. And then we'll have Quinn's talk. Of course, he'll share his slides and all. And then you can ask all of your questions in the Q&A. You have the little Q&A and we'll answer the questions after the talk. So don't hesitate to ask anything you need and we'll just go through it afterwards. So this is the last meetup for 2020, but we have already a meetup planned for February, and we welcome Yael Ben David. She's from Tel Aviv, and she will talk about the platform like Airbnb and eBooker, where you have two different types of clients. You have like the person selling something and the person buying something, and you have to talk to the two of them. So save the date for February. I know it's in a very long time. And also other things I want to share with you. If the slides go there. I'm also the co-host of another meetup about SEO. So if you are into SEO thing, join me there. Sarah, my co-host, is more about technical SEO. I'm more about on-page SEO, obviously. And so we have a little bit of everything in terms of subjects. But we have a full agenda and speakers planned until May or even June, I think now. So today we welcome Quinn, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about him, about how I met him. I met Quinn like 2 years ago at UX Copenhagen. So you know now that these 2 years ago, it was a big year for me. I was busy working on products. But since I was new in this area, I was very much questioning my impact in with language. What do I do when I contribute to a product? So I went to this conference, UX Copenhagen, and that was about ethics, something about ethics and products. I can't remember exactly, but it was an important moment for me because Quinn's talk and then the few emails we had afterwards helped me shape like my ethics in my work and how I understand my impact when I do the writing, and also how I explain it to the client. And so since then, I've been following Quinn's work. I really like his work, especially because his articles are always a deep dive in a subject and very introspective. So I can very much relate, and it makes me think a little bit afterwards. So I always end up a little bit cleverer after that. And so it was summer or maybe September, Quinn shared this open source guide. And it just, again, it was serendipity, like the right moment I needed something, because in this year I have been working on a few relaunches, and so I've had my work reread and proofread by the legal team, by the CEO, by the customer team, and each page had different kinds of feedbacks and different kind of inputs, and then the whole website is a mix match of everybody's opinion. So I thought it was a good time to invite Quinn to talk about this tone of voice. And luckily, he was available. So today, we are lucky to have him. So now it's your turn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the wonderful introduction there. I'm so glad that you were able to get some good stuff out of both the ethics conference and also when I released this content guideline. So I'm really looking forward to talking with everyone about what we're up to here. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. See if I've got this set up properly. Everything good there? Fantastic. So this is actually the first time that I'm doing a conference in this format. So I'm really excited for this. Seems like a wonderful approach to it. What I'll be talking about today is a topic called Nobody's a Copywriter, but Everybody Writes Copy. And just making sure I've got control over this. Fantastic. So I'm a product designer at a company called Sourcegraph, as well as a co-founder of Caribou, a user experience strategy and design consultancy. I've been doing this for about 12 years now in all kinds of different environments and contexts. And one of the things that I found really consistent is that some of the hardest problems I've ever had to solve in my career came about when we were trying to figure out how to talk about things. Now, to give you an example here, in one of my previous roles, I was working with a meal kit company. And if you're not familiar with meal kits, the idea is that you as a customer can choose what you would like to order each week. And the company will send you the recipe and all of the ingredients you need to cook that at home over the course of the week. And we had an everlasting conversation inside the company about what to call what you see in this picture here, and how to describe how many people it would feed. And I never would have thought it would be so hard to decide if a plate of food was a recipe or a meal. And I also didn't realize it would be so hard to decide if it was 4 servings or 4 portions. Now, what was interesting here is that it turns out that none of these words are exactly the right word to use. But making the choice between these words had a pretty big ripple effect throughout the entire project that we were working on. The fact is that the terms recipe and meal are very similar, but they have very slightly different connotations and meanings, particularly in the context of a meal kit company, where a recipe becomes a meal. But when the terms are used interchangeably, it creates all kinds of issues in the company, particularly where the company has product designers, developers, product managers, but also a culinary team dedicated to inventing recipes, and a logistics and distribution team dedicated to acquiring the ingredients and handling the deliveries and getting it all together. But everybody is using slightly different terms or don't really have alignment on those concepts and the words that we're using. Things get really complicated really fast. As a product designer, I often wish that I could just be a bit more brutalist with my copy and just write copy like, get this and cook it, and you'll be able to feed 4 of you for supper, unless you're really hungry, and then it would just be 2 of you. But I guess the reality is that it wouldn't really fit in the product. But anyway, over the course of my career, I've worked with all kinds of different companies, bootstrapped, 2-person startups, big nonprofits with 80 years of history, mature software service organizations, early stage tech companies right at the cusp of explosive growth. And all of these companies, this massive range of different types of companies, exactly none of them had anybody dedicated to copywriting for their products or services. The best case scenario for us involved product managers, designers, or developers with a knack for writing, or marketing folks who had a breadth of experience and a strong sense of brand voice and tone. That's interesting, because in all of these companies, and probably in your own company, copy is absolutely everywhere, all the time, in every part of your product or service. That's really interesting, because if nobody is a copywriter in these companies, and yet copy is everywhere, then that means everybody in the company is an accidental copywriter. Now we can see this in the language that we use inside the product or service. It can be as small as a single word. Words are symbols that evoke a larger concept, like the difference between a little plodding boat and the vast adventures and stories of a ship. Or it might be the difference between a recipe and a meal. Every member of the team is constantly building and refining a personal vocabulary of words that they use to think about the product, to describe it, and all of its components. And these words then make it into the product itself, to the customers. Every line of copy and interface, every interaction helps people to understand their place and context, what's going on, and what they can do next. And there's often way more copy than anybody realizes until the copy has to be written in the moment of immediate need. When a designer, when a developer, when a marketer writes that copy in that moment, they are accidental copywriters. And we also see this in the language that we use inside the team between each other. It's how we talk about what we're working on, what we decide to build, and how we're going to build it. Every single conversation we have inside the team reinforces concepts, relationships, and actions, and ultimately shapes how the team thinks about the product. Every single conversation leads us to be accidental copywriters. And it's also the language that we use outside of the product and the team, in how we talk about ourselves, how we talk about the company, how we talk about the team itself. Marketers, executives, hiring managers, every day, everybody in your company is writing things, blog posts, posters, social media spots, job listings. All of this language filters back through the entire experience and affects how the users and team members think about the product or service. So what I'm getting at is that every single person is an accidental copywriter. Now the thing is, If everybody's writing copy accidentally, it's quite unlikely to be altogether consistent, purposeful, or useful. Before long, we start to deal with all kinds of issues. Usability debt starts to build up. We find that many of the same things are given different names, like recipes and meals. We see that our customers end up confused and frustrated because there isn't that sense of consistency. Things get harder to use, but in subtle ways. And we, as a team, find ourselves wasting our time in circular conversations where we don't quite understand each other, but it's not really clear why. And that in turn means that people often grow wary of writing copy themselves for fear of getting it wrong. The team lacks confidence providing or requesting feedback on copy because ultimately the feedback is subjective and opinionated, which means the most assertive voices in the room will have an outsized impact on the decisions. And of course, this often leads to many of our teammates and customers finding themselves inadvertently excluded through nothing more than poor language choice. That didn't have to happen. The list goes on. I'm sorry, my screen is freezing up. There we go. The list goes on. But if everybody is an intentional copywriter, it makes the entire product and company better, even if those people aren't copywriters. When everybody is writing copy intentionally, it empowers the whole team because they feel confident in their ability to make choices about copy. And that in turn improves usability because copy is written with the recognition that even a single word can affect perception and understanding. And that creates this ripple effect throughout the entire product or company, where the product becomes more internally consistent. That in turn means that users are able to more easily learn how to use the product, get started with it, use it in their day-to-day work without having to think too much about it. And my favorite part is that it can also drive positive cultural change because the language that we use becomes more compassionate and inclusive in the product and across the whole company. Now, I hope I've convinced you at this point that everybody is an accidental copywriter and that it's worth turning them into intentional copywriters. But how exactly do we go about doing that? What I've found is that turning accidental copywriters into intentional copywriters means giving them specific and useful tools they can use to write effective content. And it means making it as easy as possible to reference in the context of their day-to-day work. And third, it also means giving the whole team shared ownership of the challenge. Now, at this moment, you're probably thinking to yourself, Quinn, that's called a style guide. And to some extent, yeah, absolutely. This is a solved problem. There's so many different resources out there available to us. Style guides, content guidelines, books that you can read on microcopy. You can look at MailChimp, Wire, Shopify, so many different teams that publish their own internal guides for anyone to use. And sometimes you see that when the companies do have the maturity and resources to have copywriters on the team, they will often run things like internal training sessions for better copywriting to give everybody a starting point. Despite this, there's a big, whopping, unsolved problem that I've personally run into, and I've seen my colleagues and friends across the industry run into again and again. Simply put, useful and effective content guidelines are really, really, really hard to make. And it's unbelievable. I spent months digging into this in a previous role, and I kept running into challenges. And when I looked back and I reflected, what I saw were three specific challenges. First, just creating the guidelines. Huge challenge. Once you've created them, you have to think about how you're going to share and use the guidelines. That's a bigger problem than it seems. And then what we often miss is also the governance around the guidelines. How exactly we're going to maintain them over time, who's making decisions. And I reflected on this, and I noticed there's some specific things that went into creating really good guidelines for content. First, guidelines really have to be your guidelines. Anybody can do the research into UX copywriting, into writing style, into brand voice and tone, but that requires a lot of intentional action that most accidental copywriters don't think about, or they just don't see it as part of their role. To be truly specific and useful, and to provide effortless reference to turn a team of accidental copywriters into intentional copywriters, the guidelines have to actually be yours. And then they have to bridge multiple concerns. Terminology, the specific word that you use, the voice and tone that you use to communicate the brand, the stylistic conventions, how exactly you format things, and of course, how to write actionable and useful language in the context of an interface. Copywriting is a combination of many of these factors brought together, the same way that a product design balances many different needs and considerations, not just the purely visual elements. What's great about combining all of these elements into a single set of guidelines is that the guidelines themselves then become a mix of standards and education. Anyone can check back in on them to find out the right way, the source of truth, but they can also learn why something happens to be the right way. And even the most perfect and complete set of guidelines on what to do won't be directly reusable by everyone unless it's really deeply woven into the context of your own product or service. It's one thing to set out what that right way or source of truth is, but it's quite another to see that in action. The better and the more useful the examples in the guidelines are, the easier it is for everyone who isn't a copywriter to go in and figure out how to write most effectively for whatever it is that they're doing at that moment. If they're left to interpret the guidelines themselves and figure out how to apply them to what they're writing, it's much harder to get into the habit of referencing the guidelines regularly because it's not providing instant answers. That brings me to the next point. If you got the guidelines, if they are fully expansive with everything they need to cover, and they're useful and they have context and examples, how is everyone else going to access them? I quickly discovered earlier in my experimentation that if they're not effortless to access and use, they just won't be used. And the bar for effortless is much lower than I would have thought. So either it has to fit perfectly into the tools the team is already using, or it has to be instantly accessible with no setup, which usually means it needs to be just a link to a website that they can open in their browser. But when these guidelines are useful, they exist, and when they are effortlessly accessible, they can quickly become viral. The more value they provide to each individual person, the more often they will be shared and referenced by everyone else. And what's neat is it's okay to start really small with these. Most of us have experienced initiatives that start with the best of intentions, but as soon as they become a project with capital letters, they get bogged down in process and formality. But what's great is that copy is absolutely everywhere, which means there are so many small ways to get started, and you can probably start them yourself. But once you've created them, which is great, it's amazing if they can thrive with shared ownership, because that means you don't have to do it all on your own, and it means that the responsibility for decision-making can be shared with the whole team. After all, the guidelines themselves reflect really fundamental decisions around information architecture and usability in your product or service. And when an entire team of copywriters gets involved, even if they're accidental copywriters turning into intentional copywriters, the guidelines will evolve very quickly with a self-reinforcing loop as everybody is able to contribute to help make the guidelines better over time. Now, all of these points are the combination of months and months of effort that brought together lots of experiments. And at a certain point, I found myself thinking, wow, I wish we had a starting point for this so we wouldn't have to just do it from scratch. So what I did at that point, I took everything I had been working on over years of effort and put it together in one place. And I created a free and open source product language framework and shared it with the world, aimed at providing this exact starting point. It's like Bootstrap for copy. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes here to give you a high-level overview of the framework and the approach that I took to it without going into it too deeply, because I'm doing my best to make sure that this doesn't seem like a sales pitch. In our Q&A after this is over, I'd be happy to dig into specific parts of it in more detail, talk about some areas a little bit more detailed, but in keeping it high level, the guidelines were really about helping everybody else create their own guidelines. So I put together a complete and semi-universal set of English guidelines. Unfortunately, I only have English as a language. I would love to make it more than just English, so if you can help with that, let me know. But complete guidelines for good copywriting. And it covers what I think are the crucial areas of a complete guideline. We've got the voice and tone. We've got how to write actionable language for specific kinds of UI elements and contexts and locations in any product or service, the style and mechanics, and a simple example of a word list to get you started. And then, since the context is so important in making useful guidelines, the entire thing is created for a fictional product, which I call Forward. This is an imaginary platform for people to share and ask for recommendations for books to read, based on a shared reading history. The guidelines are then absolutely loaded with examples of what to do and what to avoid, and every example is real in the sense that it's for the Forward product. But since it's just a set of guidelines, this means it's a starting point so that somebody else can go in and replace it with examples of their very own product. And what's neat is, as a free and open source framework, unlike other guidelines that other teams publish that you might be able to reference, you are completely free to directly copy and paste and reuse any part of these guidelines. So instead of spending time trying to write your own from scratch while avoiding copying anything, copying is absolutely encouraged. All you need to do is go through and update the examples to reflect your own product or service so that it's useful for your team and they become your guidelines. And then mindful as well that they have to be incredibly easy to access and share. I put them together in two different ways. For starters, you can access them as a microsite at uxcopy.quinnkeast.com. We'll share that link separately. You can just use that as everyday reference. Check it out, build an appetite for it around your team. But on your own, when you're ready to make this yours, you can download the entire source for this microsite, customize it, and then launch it into your own microsite with no friction at all. I know that not everybody is comfortable with doing that, so we also have an option where you can use an existing Notion template for the guidelines. So if your company is using Notion, you can also just go in, duplicate that, add it to Notion. And the last thing here, to make them as easy as possible for anybody to contribute to these guidelines, all of them are just written in Markdown. So that means that while you can just copy directly from the microsite, you can also, if you have any experience with editing text, just edit the Markdown and contribute to the guidelines as is. Now, I know that these guidelines are used at Sourcegraph and Klarna today. I know there's other teams using them, I just don't know who they are. So if you use these and you find them useful, please let me know. I'd love to know what's working well for you and what could do better. So to wrap this all up, you can go back into this bit in the Q&A. Nobody is a copywriter, but we all write copy, and there's a lot of it. So we can work together, and you can lead the way in turning all of these accidental copywriters into intentional copywriters, and in turn, we end up with more usable, consistent, and inclusive products. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. That's amazing. Well, to be honest, I used much more the UX copy, the Quinn Keast, than the GitHub version of it. So I write in French, and many of the principles, they are the same, even though it's a different language. I mean, we have the same issues with the passive voice, with the not concise languages and very long sentences. So I think for me, it was a great inspiration to read it and like go back to my own, which are so far like Google document that sometimes turn into Word document. But yeah, it was a great inspiration to look at it and just check my documents to make it better. And I've included many more examples, and I really like the two boxes with the check and the cross. And sometimes people agree to writing principles, but they don't understand what it means. And when they when they see it written, what it actually means to write in present tense, then they understand and they're like, oh yes, I want that. Oh no, I don't want that. So examples is everything.
You know what's interesting about that specific example is that writing consistently is very hard. It wasn't until I took my own guidelines and adapted them to Sourcegraph that somebody else on my team came back to me and said, Quinn, I think your example of what to do for writing in present tense is actually in past tense. And it turns out they're absolutely right. Even while trying to write in present tense for that, I wrote in past tense. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, you need the review and the feedback. Even when you write and you have all of these principles in your head, it's not enough. So I see we have a question in the Q&A. So you can just use the Q&A and ask all of your questions. I see we have one and it's a pretty long one. So I'm going to read all of it. And so it's Andreas is telling us, so reading now. I realized that it's important that even backend developers are aware of the power of words and use consistent wording when creating the data model. I agree. For example, not that the user sees recipe, but in the database, it's called meal. Do you have a story how you could make backend developers aware of this and make them ask for good words already when they create the data model? Oh yes, this is so often that the words used within the team end up in the product for the users. So Quinn, any good input?
This is an amazing question. Thank you for this. So this is actually the perfect example of how the language that the team is using ends up in the product. And I don't think I can give you an exciting story about specifically this, but what I will say is that it comes down to the process and how we treat language as part of the design and product development lifecycle. Too often what we will see is that we're using things like lorem ipsum when we are coming up with ideas, when we're talking about how these relationships will work, when we do wireframes and figure out what the flows will be. And in my view, when you're working at those very, very early levels, when you're breadboarding, as I call it, with just words and drawing quick connections between things, when you are doing wireframes, at that point, you need to keep language high fidelity. At that point, if you start shortcutting and saying this would be a meal here, a recipe there, not really thinking about what those connotations are, then that's where things get encoded very early on in the wrong way, and you end up with usability dead. So what I would say at that point is that the important thing is that we are involving as many different disciplines in this initial design process, and we specifically call out that the language that we're using here is important. If we get the right term, everything else makes sense later. If we shortcut here, then we're going to run into issues very quickly. What's much harder is coming back after these things are already encoded and figuring out how to make changes. That one is tricky because it doesn't necessarily make sense to change things in the data model, because that is not what you're seeing when the users are using it. But what you will find is that if the developers are starting to understand the importance of this language and they understand why you need a new term, or you need to change the term. For example, this question here talks about the users use recipe, but in the database it's called a meal. So that's a sign that something changed around how the team understood the product at some point. And you don't necessarily need to change it in the back, but you do need to say explicitly that you are using this new term in the product now, and please refer to that in the conversation. Please make sure it maps with that in the context of the product. And what you can do is you can use the terminology or the word list to really give a source of truth for this. And what I can give you right now, actually, I'm going to share my screen again with you. Hopefully you can see my screen okay. Yeah. But in the word list here, you can specifically call out terms that you're no longer using anymore. And in this case here, we have an example. A run is replaced and is now being called a series. You might do this in different ways. In this guideline, I'm trying to keep it very lightweight. But at Sourcegraph, we actually have an explanation for why one term is now used instead of another. And as soon as people identify, hopefully the developers, that we are using different terms between the data model and the product, then we can start a conversation and say, what is the decision? What is the term that we need to use everywhere? And then stick to that.
So thanks for the question, Andreas, and thank you, Quinn, for the answer. I see we have another question here. Aha, that's a good one. How do you make the case to create guidelines when everybody says, we don't need this, we already have words, right?
That's also hard. And that's something I've had to deal with. And I think it comes down to the perception of the size of the project. And like I said earlier, as soon as it becomes a project with capital letters, that implies that you need to involve many different stakeholders. You need to make sure that you have a plan in mind for how you're going to launch it, how you're going to build it, and it becomes so much more work. And the fact is that the guidelines, when complete and fully useful, will have that fullest, the terminology, the voice and tone, the actionable language. The fact is, you don't need all of those to get it started. Chances are you already know where there's some challenges in how the team is approaching copy. And if you simply say, hey, this seems like something we could use a source of truth around so that we can make this easier, then you can use whatever tool makes the most sense at that moment to create the starting point for these guidelines. And then if you follow everything else I've been talking about today, about sharing it, making it easy to access, referencing it consistently, then you will find that they start to grow, and the appetite will grow to have more extensive guidelines. Somebody will come in and say, hey, I was looking for this and I couldn't find it. And so that's a great moment. You can go in, you can update it, you can tell everybody, hey, we just made the guidelines even better. And at some point, you will find that you have a living, useful set of guidelines. And you didn't really have to make a big effort to get there.
So you would say the guidelines are more of a living document that is going to evolve with the company rather than something very prescriptive that says from above, oh, here's how we decided, now you do it, everybody.
Yes. I do think it's very important that the guidelines are seen as a source of truth, but that doesn't need to be commanded, so to speak, but rather it needs to be the result of a mix of heuristics, best practices, existing company knowledge, and collaborative decision making. If your team together has figured out that this word works better than that word, that's something you can say in the guidelines. And then it's not somebody saying what to do, but rather it's a way of capturing what works best.
So it's rather like a set of recommendation than sort of rules.
I would say that's exactly right. Although I do suggest that it's good for it to be seen as a source of truth, but a source of truth that can change and evolve.
Yeah. Great. Thanks for this answer. And thank you for the question. And we have another question from Annie, who is saying that she's also creating language guidelines at the moment. And that's a lot of work to cover all aspects. So her question is, when you create guidelines, Quinn, do you collaborate with marketing when creating the guidelines? And how do you roll them out within the company and make sure it's actually used and not forgotten in a drawer or just forgotten documents? So 2 questions here.
Great question. So collaborating with marketing is absolutely something you should do, particularly when it comes to voice and tone, because voice and tone as part of copywriting is ultimately how you express the brand character and identity. And that is something that often companies have and is documented separately in more specifically defined brand guidelines, or it's something that the company doesn't really understand. And they kind of evaluate whether or not something is like the brand. But that's quite subjective. So what you can actually do is you can use the guidelines in creating the voice and tone guidelines as a starting point for figuring out what that brand character is. In the guidelines that I've put together, I advocate pretty strongly for just having a set of 3 very simple character attributes. And 3 is usually enough to capture the idea of a brand. And if you have those, then you can figure out, okay, so how do we apply that voice to everything else in the guideline? And some people are better at this than others. And involving the people that are great at it, which are often marketing folks, is a great way to get more cross-disciplinary involvement in the guidelines. However, much like I said earlier, you don't need to get it all done and perfect before you launch it, but rather get what you can in place and keep going from there. The nice thing about voice and tone is, unlike a lot of other things in guidelines, it tends to be shorter and not easier to do, but less work to create overall. And that's, of course, you're using this framework as a starting point. And rolling them out in the company and used by all who write some copy. The first thing I would say there is that I don't think it's realistic for everybody to use them. And instead, what you really need to do is make people aware that they exist and that they are a reference, and make them as easy as possible to share that reference. And so as an example, if you are in a position where you can review copy in GitHub pull requests, as an example, then that is the perfect place to suggest changes to what has been written in the product and tie those references directly back to the framework. And I do this in my own work. I say that this could be rewritten in line with the guidelines referenced here. And then what that means is that instead of telling people you got to use this, people discover, hey, this is useful. I could just go here and save some time and make it better from the start. And they become more and more aware of what is available through those guidelines.
Yeah, so basically it would be identify the moment or the people where you can share the guidelines and not trying to share it with everybody at first, and finding moments where you can show the added value and the fact that it's easier to use them. Good point. So thank you, Annie, for the question, and thank you, Quinn, for the answer. And we have a question. The old and good question, what is tone and voice? And then what's the best way to approach defining the voice and tone? So that's a question we have very often in companies. So what is the tone and voice?
So the easiest way to say the difference is that voice is the brand character. It is personification. It is the personality of the brand. And then tone is, I'm actually looking at my own guideline here to make sure I've got it. This is so hard to explain to people, but tone is how you express that personification of the character in different situations. If you think about how you would talk to somebody if you were in an upbeat mood versus when things are very serious, you are the same person in both of those situations, but the way you express yourself is going to be different. And that is the difference between voice and tone. You will always sound like you, but you will have a different way of letting that come across depending on the different approaches. In terms of defining the voice and tone, I would say that tone itself is more of a formulaic type of thing. In the guidelines, you will find a great reference from NNG about the 4 dimensions of tone. And these are, I'm looking at these here, but it kind of goes between funny and serious, formal and casual. You can check this out. But the idea here is that you can push and pull these levers to address the tone for any given situation. So you can look at that, you can adopt that straight up and figure out how that applies to your voice. The trickier part is defining what the voice is. And that comes back to the brand topic again. Now, keeping this really open-ended, that goes beyond something you can easily do on your own if you want to get true collaborative buy-in for these guidelines, if you want people to agree that this is correct. If you already have brand guidelines that reflect that voice, great. Use them, figure out what that means, put suggestions for. If you don't have those, what you can do is you can run workshops with key stakeholders who understand the brand, have been around for a long time, have a deep understanding of what that abstract brand thing is. And you can use different techniques to get the language down that they use to talk about the brand, to reference the brand, and ideally allowing on what attributes best reflect the company. Now, this is a much bigger topic than I can really dig into on this call, but I can share separate resources around this when the talk is done to dig into that topic.
Yeah, so voice is more about the personality and the tone is more the situation. I remember one of my colleagues often using the example of the hotel to explain the tone. You know, when you get into a hotel, everybody's really warm and saying, welcome, how are you doing? And then when you start checking in, usually the people get more serious, and when it's the moment to pay or when they talk about the rules, then they get even more serious, and then it's a bit more understandable for a client who has no idea to visualize the situation and understand that it's the same person talking, but really the tone and the type of explanations are different. So I've used that example again. I found it really useful. So thank you for the explanation. And let's go to the, next question. Cora has a question. She's browsing the framework and asking, do you have a section on inclusive language in there as well?
I do. If you happen to be browsing the framework, in the section about style and mechanics, there's a section about writing about people. And this comes down to how we write about other people in a way that's compassionate, inclusive, and respectful. And I had to think about this for a little while to figure out where to put it in this framework. But ultimately, I believe that writing inclusively is a baseline for writing well, in the same way that you need to know grammar, how to use punctuation. And so I've included how to write about people as everything else, with a very clear set of examples for what to do and what to avoid. And if you have suggestions on how to keep improving this, please let me know. I would love to hear the feedback.
Thank you for the answer. And we have a question from Peter. When might a word list require definitions, more like a glossary or a dictionary?
This becomes very important. Definitions are very important when you have a product where you need specialist understanding, or at least a more technical understanding. So as an example, my company right now, Sourcegraph, is a universal code search tool. And so the people that are using it day by day are very technically grounded. They have a strong understanding of how to use these tools. They use technical language in their day-to-day work. And the fact is that you have quite a range of expertise on that scale. And I myself don't even understand the full vocabulary that we use in the product. And that means everybody who is in the company and needs to really understand what it is they're talking about, what they're working on, has a way to easily get the correct definitions of any unfamiliar term. What's nice about that as well, and something I would like to update the framework to include, is that when somebody new joins the company, they can shortcut a lot of their understanding what they are working on if they can just look up all those words that they don't recognize in those early onboarding conversations.
So thanks for the answer. And thank you, Peter, for the question. Barbara, we have a question. How do you avoid using pretty much the same guidelines or even copy through the different projects you work on? Yes, good question. Like, do you have is your style of writing on everything you create?
Ultimately, it comes down to patterns. If you look at front-end UI frameworks like Bootstrap or Tailwind or any of these tools, they all establish these baseline elements that exist in all platforms. Buttons, headlines, links, all these different elements that are shared. And I strongly believe that copy is very much the same, especially things like microcopy in the product. So what that means is that the guidelines structurally could be pretty much the same. You can have the same sections, you can have exactly the same content, but the actual examples and the actual voice and tone expressed in those examples has to be your product. The simple fact is punctuation is mostly the same between every product, but the examples that you use to display that punctuation should reflect the product you're actually working on. And if you do that, the fact that the overall structure is pretty much the same is totally fine. In fact, it can make it even better because there's consistency between guidelines. So if you happen to start working on a new one, you know exactly how to use these, you know exactly how to update it so that it reflects the product you're working on. It doesn't need to be totally unique, it needs to be unique for you.
Good. Thank you for the answer. And thank you, Barbara, for the question. And we have a question from Katie. How do you think the best way to resolve a disagreement between writers when working on style guide? If it's developed by multiple writers? Good question.
Well, my initial answer is always use the Oxford comma. There are certain disagreements that I think just come down to personal preference around style, and that is difficult to deal with because then you start looking at the subjective side of it. And at that point, I think it should be resolved like any other conflicts you might disagree about at work. If I'm a designer and I disagree with a design outcome, I would ask, can you tell me how you got to this outcome? What informed it? What decisions went into it? What trade-offs do we have to think about? And ultimately, sometimes I'll go, okay, I understand what's going on here. The solution is actually just fine for what it does. And ultimately, it's a subjective preference. At that point, somebody has to say, okay, if it is a bigger issue, and I'm going to call out specifically terminology, as in somebody's not sure whether it should be a recipe or a meal, then that's a sign that there's some ambiguity around something important in the product. And at that point, it should probably go beyond just the writers. At that point, you need to start talking to the people that are involved in the product in other ways, like designers, developers, product managers. You need to understand how those terms came about in the first place. And you need to understand how people are looking at and using those terms today. And in the case of something like recipes and meals, that's a good sign that it might be time to do as much as doing user testing before creating some kind of guideline around which one is the right one to use. So it depends. Depends.
Yeah, I really like the questions you provided, because very often we feel like, oh, it's a subjective preference. But I really like the idea really to go beyond this and ask the person, oh, how did you get to this preference and what are the trade-offs? So I think it's good to step back sometimes from preference and discuss it in a very equal ground. So thank you for the questions and thank you for the answer. And we have a question, how do content guidelines fit in with design system, or are they two separate things?
That's a hard one. One easy one. What I think is the content guidelines are part of design. And design is part of content. And ultimately, what you're talking about is guidelines for the entire product or service. And I think the best possible guidelines that you can get are those that act as a resource for anybody that needs to answer a question about building the product or service in the best possible way. And so honestly, what that means is combining content with brand, with product, with whatever other resources are useful for the team. I think the problem is when we create hard distinctions between them, especially when it comes to things like actionable language. Because actionable language specifically applies to interface elements and things the users are acting on in some way. And that is, it cannot be separated from design and implementation. The product language framework that I created is a really focused thing around the content itself. But if your company gets to the point where they can have a mature design system documentation, where they include examples of things like confirmation dialogues, error messages, then tying them together in one place, or even creating a single set of guidelines in one place, is the best possible way to deal with them. But that's a big project. Again, capital letters, a project. So do what you can and then find ways to bring them together.
Yeah, so again, starting small and building step by step. Thank you for the answer, and thank you, Jen, for the question. Do we have another questions? We have a few minutes left, so if you have a question. No, so I'll just ask mine. So I was thinking, when you are in a company that is very much a beginner about languages and still writing with a very formal written tone, like which part of the style guide, like which writing principle is most important? Because often there is no way you can start applying all of the principles. Like, so where do you start? Do you start with short sentences and not long sentences with commas? Or do you start with present tense or avoiding passive? Or what is the most important part?
I'm personally biased as a product designer, but I would say the most important place to start is anything that affects user action. So there's copy absolutely everywhere. There's copy in the product, there's copy outside the product, it gets larger than that, and you simply can't go through all of that and get it done. But what you can do is prioritize the types of copy and where it's used. I would say that anything that is related to call to action, conversions, confirmation dialogues, or error dialogues, error messages, those kinds of things are probably the most easy to isolate and say, we are going to address whatever we can in this instance. And that could be multiple things. It could be, how conversational it is. It could be the voice. It could be the punctuation. It can be all those things together. But instead of trying to get like a heuristic for style, you're focusing on specific applications of it. And what's neat about that is that you should see usability improvements pretty quick, because you're essentially saying that the areas that usability matters most are the areas we have to fix first. And then you can do everything else around that.
That's a really good approach. So it means that it's not about choosing one principle of writing over another, but rather choosing where you apply the writing. So that's, I've got my post-its written down. That's a really good point. Thank you. And I see that when I was talking, we had another question from Paige. So she says she started creating as much alignment as possible, glossary, language, etc. on Google Sheets. And she noticed it's been sort of a pain to get people to even look at them. Oh, yes. These are the tools that the writers, translator use. As a product designer, did you learn GitHub Bootstrap because it felt like the most practical tool, or was this something you already knew?
Great question. This is very familiar. I already knew how to use these tools myself, so it was just an option I had. However, I started trying to do these things with other tools, like you say, Google Sheets, Word documents, Google Documents, and I never found them very effective for exactly the same reason. People don't even look at them, let alone use them. And I thought about this from the perspective of a product designer. And I believe part of the reason for that is because Google Sheets, Google Docs, these tools create a working context, while a microsite creates a reference context. And it is a lot easier to jump around on a microsite than it is to find a specific Google Sheet, which is necessarily a different type of data being used in a different way. So for me, it felt like a natural fit then to just go ahead and create a microsite, because that was the easiest way to get this done and built and launched. And I think it really comes down to the way people feel about using it, whether it's work or reference.
Yeah, it's true. Every time we look for information, we open a browser. We don't look into a document or search a folder. So thank you for the insight, and thank you, Peijen, for the question. And we can take a last question. We have a few minutes. So Daniel is asking something. So would you recommend to apply to copywriting roles as UX writers? In other words, if a company does not have a UX writer yet, what are the things to look out for when applying blindly? A team that has UX designers, maybe?
Okay. I think it comes down to expectations for the role. On a very personal level, I would always be afraid of applying as a copywriter and ending up doing marketing copy. And nothing against marketing copy. I love writing marketing copy. It's just a different day-to-day focus than UX copywriting. So I think it's a matter of saying, okay, I want to be a UX copywriter, and I'm going to apply my previous experience to doing that well. And I think that you can go seamlessly between them. It's just a matter of having the right mindsets and methods. And with UX copywriting in specific, going beyond just the copywriting. I strongly believe that a good UX copywriter also has to have some skills that are very similar to product designers, like being able to do user research, being able to iterate and test different versions of what you are writing, being able to bring together the user's perspective with the business needs in achieving specific goals, and being able to work with a broader product development team. So if you are a copywriter and you want a UX role, go for it. Like, I absolutely believe you can do it. Just make sure that it's actually a UX copywriting role and not a marketing copywriting role. And vice versa. If you love writing marketing copy and you're not interested in writing error messages for product, you're probably not going to enjoy being a UX copywriter. So just make sure that you have clarity on which one is which.
Yeah, I think I can relate to Daniel. Daniel, if you live in Switzerland too, there are very few roles. And I think in private companies, the tasks of the copywriters are often aligned in the many activities in a marketing role or in a digital marketing role. So it's like, it's not differentiated. And what I have seen is that it was easier to do copywriting in a web agency, although it's difficult to create a role because when you are around developers, I mean, they don't always see the value of the copy. So there is a little bit of education. However, it's still easier to do UX writing in a web agency than in a private company. So, but this is my personal experience so far, because in the agency life, they are much more project building and for different clients. So even if with one client, they may not be so interested in having a UX writer in the team. For another clients, there will be another opportunity. So you get like also a more diverse experience on diverse projects, like, you know, and you don't only work for one. However, it could be awesome to work on the same project. I mean, so, but if you're looking for a job, good luck. We wish you the best. And if I see something around, I'll make sure to share it. So we did 1 hour, so it's now the end of the webinar. If you have someone has a very last question? No, but thank you. We had so many questions. Honestly, that makes me happy. I'm really happy you enjoyed having Quinn with us and really enjoyed the opportunity to ask him questions. And I'm pretty sure that if you have anything coming to mind, you can write to him.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear from you.
And in case you don't find him, which I doubt, but you can still write to me and I just transfer the message. So really, we are here. If you have anything, we are happy to answer. And well, thank you for joining us tonight. And I'm hoping to see you some other time, either follow you on social media, and maybe sometimes face-to-face again, because it's a bit still strange to me to not see the participants with webinars, but I'm still pretty happy to see your name and to see your interaction. And also, thanks a million, Quinn, for being here tonight. I know that preparing a presentation, it takes a long time to prepare the slides and the subjects, and also your energy just to be here tonight and share your experience and take the time. And this meetup would be nothing without you willing to share your experience. So really, thanks a million. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
So thank you, everybody, and have a good night. Bye.